inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. From Thomas Paine. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineering Watch Radio, Global Alert News Hour for February 25th, 2017. Again, commercial-free news hour paid for by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. Too much news to cover, too little time to cover it. We are at a very critical moment in human history. This show is broadcast throughout Northern California, again on KQMS, 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. This show is also rebroadcast on the PRN radio network on the East Coast, 2 o'clock Eastern Time Saturday afternoon. Recordings of this show can be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the top stories, recent, and radio sections, and in the KQMS archives. Again, a reminder about the materials, essential materials at Orchard Nutrition in Redding, California. If you live in Shasta County, if you live near Redding, and you'll put these materials to use, geoengineeringwatch.org, with the resources we have available, are trying to make materials available for those in Shasta County who will put them to use. Materials on climate engineering, vaccination crimes that are occurring in our society with our children not being disclosed by our media, being sheltered by the medical industrial complex, and information on 9/11, the event that changed the world. The official narrative, according to now nearly 3,000 of the world's top architects and engineers, the mainstream narrative on that issue is completely and utterly false, impossible based on the laws of science and physics. Find out what you don't know. The next library event in Redding to air a documentary, which we will announce in the next week, will be March 25th, 2:30 p.m. at the Redding Library. Free event, free materials. If you care about what's happening in your world and how quickly the walls are closing in, come and find out, again, what you don't know and connect with others who also care enough to come and find out what's happening in their world. Lots to cover. I want to jump into a few stories that, again, are not being covered. We'll get into other headlines and cover the whole picture in a moment. Lethal vaccinations are not the only crime of the medical industrial industry. Of course, we know that. How unimaginably irresponsible is the modern medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex that has prescribed drugs that are creating addicts in our society, that are killing an unimaginable amount of people every single day. I'm talking about opiates. And the opiate addiction is completely out of control. And what an unimaginable conflict of interest it is when we have our medical practitioners being paid staggering amounts of money by those who create vaccinations, being paid staggering amounts of money by those who manufacture the prescription opiate drugs that have now killed, opiates and opiate addiction has now killed more Americans than the Vietnam War. Consider that, 91 Americans dying every single day from opiate addiction, much of it from prescription opiates prescribed by the medical industrial complex. Do we hear anything about this? Nothing. Do we hear anything about the hospital-related deaths, infections, incorrect procedures being carried out? And how many medical practitioners actually carry on continuing education other than what they've been fed by the medical industrial complex, that they take as gospel and seem to stop any further research and investigation at that point because their paychecks and pensions so often depend on towing the line for the medical industrial complex? Is that not the case? It's absolutely the case, as I outlined in previous shows. When we have health care industries that are paying as much as $400 per patient that is administered the full set of vaccinations, and that those massive bonuses, pediatricians in the U.S. have an average of over 1,500 patients. If they don't administer 63% of those patients with the full set of vaccinations, they can lose their entire bonus of up to $400 per patient. We're talking about staggering amounts of money, unimaginable conflicts of interest. And the same is true with the opiate prescriptions that are being doled out like candy. And consider that. More U.S. citizens, more Americans have died from opiate overdose, much of it prescribed by the medical industrial complex, than died in the Vietnam War. Consider that. And let's ask this question now as well. The prison industrial complex. How many addicts that were created by the medical industrial complex are now incarcerated by the prison industrial complex? This is what our society is built on. And then the military industrial complex, of course, behind so many other cataclysms that are unfolding on the planet right now. We'll get to more of those headlines in a minute. But again, to consider the total hypocrisy of the medical industrial complex and all other agencies connected to the corporatocracy that currently runs the world. To say one more time, if you think the amount of prescription drug deaths is shocking, then remember the vaccination injuries we've talked about so many times, the vaccination deaths, and remember the skyrocketing respiratory mortality, dementia mortality, countless other human ailments that are all in one form or another connected to the completely out of control power structure assault on the planet and the entire web of life. The ongoing geoengineering weather warfare assault is at the top of the list of threats that we currently face. I would ask this question: will we collectively stand against this insanity, or will we go silently into the night? Let's get to headlines that we're not being told about by those who control the flow of mainstream news. Connecting some dots, here's a story that must be understood. Here's the headline: Trump left Saudi Arabia off his immigration ban. Here's the shocking reason why. How many have considered this? From this report, the petrodollar system was an arrangement that the U.S. would guarantee the House of Saud's survival, Saudi Arabia, tyrannical nation that we don't seem to care about because of the reasons I'm about to cite. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would, quote, take the oil weapon off the table, number one. Two, use its dominant position in OPEC to ensure that all oil transactions, and this is key, would only happen in U.S. dollars. Three, invest billions of U.S. dollars from oil revenue in U.S. treasuries. This let the U.S. issue more debt and finance previously unimaginable budgets. Oil is the world's most traded and strategic commodity. If foreign countries need U.S. dollars to trade oil, it creates a very compelling reason to hold large dollar reserves. For example, if Italy wants to buy oil from Kuwait, it has to purchase U.S. dollars on the foreign exchange market to pay for the oil first. This creates an artificial market for U.S. dollars. The dollar is just a middleman in the countless transactions that have nothing to do with U.S. products or services. Ultimately, the arrangement boosts the U.S. dollar's purchasing power. It also creates a deeper, more liquid market for U.S. dollars and U.S. treasuries. Plus, the U.S. has the unique privilege of buying imports, including oil, with its own currency, which it can print in unlimited quantities. Finishing from this report, it's hard to overstate how much the petrodollar system benefits the U.S. dollar. It's allowed the U.S. government and many Americans to live beyond their means for decades. And it's the reason the media and political elite give the Saudis special treatment. Finally, it's the reason why President Trump left the Saudis off his recent immigration ban. Speaking of oil, and isn't it all about oil at some level? Will the Dakota protest be defeated at the hands of the order followers, carrying out the dictates of the power structure, or will we renew our efforts and refuse to yield, peacefully refuse to yield? Time will tell. More headlines. Australia is headed for economic Armageddon. These are all headlines from last week, by the way, from that report. Australia is headed for an economic Armageddon with record household debt, record foreign debt, a massive housing bubble, all creating a perfect storm that could, quote, wipe out millions of families. Australia is also suffering, as I stated in last week's show, from record heat, record forest fires, crop collapse, and so on. Another headline, global trade disaster now nearly certain. It is certain. As I've stated over and over, the artificial stock market numbers on which Americans seem to base reality mean nothing. When the biosphere collapse, the financial house of cards will follow, certainly. Another headline, virtually everyone agrees that the current stock market valuations are not sustainable and then that a great crash is coming. That's the headline, but just plug that into everything I've stated show after show. Another headline, global arms trade reaches highest point since Cold War era. That's what our economy is largely based on at this point. As the ship goes down, the ship of planet Earth, what's our species doing? Building more weapons of mass destruction. If that's not a harbinger of total insanity, what is? What is? Another headline. Trump tells Reuters he wants to expand nuclear arsenal and make the U.S., quote, top of the pack. Does that not plug into the insanity I just mentioned? We're not the top of the pack already when we spend more than the next 7 to 10 countries combined? Are we not the epitome of the insanity I just described? And how many Americans wave their flags and think that's wonderful, as if somehow that will preserve their way of life? The way of life I just described as being artificially sustained for a temporary time due to the petrodollar, due to the kind of behind-the-curtain orchestrations that have been going on for decades that most Americans have really not wanted to know about in any way, shape, or form, as long as their personal party could continue. Another headline, U.S. Navy carrier, quote, strike force begins South China Sea patrols. Again, who's in whose backyard? All over the world. If a Chinese carrier strike force was patrolling in the Gulf of Mexico, would that be okay with Americans? I think not. Time for the hypocrisy to end. I'm not stating the Chinese government is benevolent or the Russian government, but I'm saying who is provoking what at this point? Time to look in the mirror for Americans. Another headline, Cold War. Russia calls for new world order as NATO sends troops to the Baltics and Poland. More of what I just talked about. Who is in whose backyard? And in regard to Russia, as I've stated in previous shows, my wife being from Lithuania, having experienced Russian occupation firsthand, no love in Lithuania for what happened, because of what happened, and you can't blame them. And I'm not stating, again, that other governments are necessarily benevolent. There's long, dark histories everywhere. Those who have the most power are the most corrupt. And who has by far the most power? By far. And who is pushing and prodding toward World War III all over the globe because it's the last card the U.S. Western power structure has to play. The walls are closing in. The petrodollar is collapsing. It's why Saddam Hussein was taken out, why Gaddafi was taken out, why Syria is being dealt with, because the U.S. empire is desperately trying to maintain the petrodollar. It's connected to everything I've talked about, show after show after show. Americans need to understand how these dots connect. The central banks print the money. They have to ensure that the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency and the petrodollar, and that's what sustains the empire. But that's falling apart. Desperation is now welling up in every aspect of the military-industrial complex in the Western world. They are pushing us toward World War III because it's the last card they have to play. Another headline. As construction near Standing Rock restarts, pipeline fights flare across the U.S. This is part of the desperation that's going to occur societally. It's occurring all over the globe. And to give an example, how many people really understood what happened in Rwanda, for example, the genocide? About 800,000 people killed with machetes, literally. How many Americans heard about that and heard about the real reasons why that happened? It's not about freedom and democracy. When you see the military commercials over and over and over, if they want to get to you, they have to come through us, as if we're the ones defending ourselves from the rest of the world, as if the 9/11 incident was somebody else doing that to us. Can't tell me any logical thinking person could believe that our military, vastly superior military with incredibly competent individuals, could have possibly allowed that to happen on their watch unless they were told to stand down. And in fact, they were. If you do any legitimate investigation, you will find out that our military brothers and sisters believed that the whole 9/11 event was a drill. You can't tell me our military couldn't deal with commercial airliners that were off course and clearly hijacked for 90 minutes before they crashed into buildings. You can't tell me that. That's completely irrational. They were told to stand down. Dick Cheney took over the reins when 9/11 happened. All these facts are there. If anybody cared to look, if Americans cared to pull their head out of the sand and start to take a part in the fight for the greater good that we must all engage in, or we will soon have nothing left to salvage. Another headline: biological terrorism could kill more people than nuclear attacks. Bill Gates to warn world leaders. What a twisted statement from Bill Gates, who is a part of the problem in every aspect, who's a part of the eugenics programs that are being carried out around the world under the guise of vaccinations. This is the sort of Orwellian doublespeak world that we live in. Another headline: mysterious radiation spreading across Europe after authorities keep it secret. Is that a surprise? That's what these agencies do. This is a headline from last week. As I've stated show after show, their job is not to disclose threats to the public, but to hide them. That includes EPA, water quality testing, and so many more. I'll get to an air quality testing headline in a moment that most didn't see because the mainstream media covered it up. Let's cover that right now, in fact, since we're on the subject. We've had a couple whistleblowers in California that only local media covered that stated publicly people in their agencies were shredding air testing data to hide it. Is that a surprise? Climate engineering is certainly a part of that equation. There was a mountain of toxic heavy metals raining down on all of us. Lab tests from all over the state, California, and all over the globe prove it. We've got about 70 lab tests in Shasta-Siskiyou County alone, some of them taken by former government scientists, that prove a mountain of toxic heavy metals is raining down on us. And now we've had whistleblowers from state air quality testing state on the record that documents are being shredded to hide very, very dire issues. Did mainstream cover it? No. Didn't hear a thing. I want to get to more headlines, then I'll try to connect these dots and weave it together so it makes more sense. Here's a headline from last week. Record challenging warmth to hold in northeastern U.S. through Friday. Consider this: the engineered weather whiplash will continue. And for the record, high temperatures in the U.S. are outpacing the engineered cool-down record lows by an astounding ratio. On that note, 5,294 daily high temperature records were broken across the country from February 1st through February 20th. During that time frame, only a handful of record lows were set, engineered record lows. The ratio right now, record high to record low, is 60 plus to 1. Over 60 to 1. And that ratio will worsen as the climate system continues to come apart. Does anyone remember the record high to snow in less than a day in New York that just happened a little over a week ago? Now it's happening in many other places around the country. Record high to snow in a day or two. This is the weather whiplash, the extreme weather whiplash that is becoming the norm. Climate engineering is fueling this. It doesn't mean there's nothing else wrong with the climate besides climate engineering. Anthropogenic activity has decimated the planet in too many ways to begin to quantify, and unfortunately too many people don't want to believe that. They want to blame everything on climate engineering, and that's not true either. And unfortunately, in the environmental communities, in the climate science communities, in the global warming communities, they somehow unimaginably hypocritically choose to willfully ignore the climate engineering elephant in the room. And to them, I would say this: how can you possibly have a legitimate discussion about the climate without first and foremost discussing climate engineering and its unimaginably destructive effect on Earth's climate and life support systems? Back to the record warmth headline that I just read. It does not mention that the continued record-shattering warmth was followed by a completely engineered chemical cooldown, as those I've just mentioned, and that the theatrically named cooldown was Winter Storm Quid. This engineered winter storm was fed with moisture straight out of the Gulf of Mexico. Again, how exactly does that happen? The patent weather modification technology of chemical ice nucleation is how it happens. The power structure paid disinformation order follower actors at the Weather Channel continue to look more and more uncomfortable with the make it up as they go lies they put out in order to help cover the tracks of the climate engineers. Their job is, and has been, to explain away the completely geoengineered weather scenarios as being, quote, natural. Primary sponsors of the Weather Channel disinformation station are the U.S. military-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex. What a surprise. As I continue into more weather disaster headlines, it's important to keep this critical point in mind. Any and all forms of human activity, as I stated earlier, that alter the biosphere and the Earth's energy balance are forms of geoengineering. The atmosphere doesn't know the difference between a particle from a smokestack or one that's been intentionally sprayed from the back of a geoengineering jet aircraft. And, as I stated earlier, those who falsely claim that the only problem with the climate and the biosphere is climate engineering are every bit as much in denial as those who deny climate engineering itself. Those who claim the planet isn't even warming are harming the fight to stop climate engineering even more, as such a narrative is exactly what the climate engineers want the masses to falsely believe and parrot. Credibility is crucial in the fight to expose and halt climate engineering, which will remain my primary focus. On that note, the drought in California and now the excessive rain in many places of California, people seem to question or ask, how could that happen if the geoengineers were causing drought? I ask you to consider the big picture. It doesn't mean that they can't allow or augment deluge either. This is geoengineering. They have their hand on the spigot. They can create drought and deluge nearly anywhere they choose to and nearly at any time they choose to. They can chemically nucleate snow over the pyramids and over desert regions at 50 plus degrees. In fact, the Weather Channel last week, one of their primary paid disinformation actors went to great length to explain why it was snowing at nearly 50 degrees. And I personally can't imagine how such an individual can look himself in the mirror. But that's what they're doing. And I challenge anybody, watch Weather Channel and see if you don't see exactly what I'm talking about. Their job is to make it up as they go, hide the tracks from geoengineering, and the things they say on the Weather Channel are so utterly and totally absurd from a scientific perspective. But that's what they're paid to do. Cover the tracks of the geoengineers. Let's get to more headlines. Here's another. Mexico City, parched and sinking, faces a water crisis. Why is it sinking? Because they're pumping the water out of the ground, just like the Central Valley in California is sinking rapidly for the same reason. From the Mexico City report, it's a cycle made worse by climate change. More heat and drought mean more evaporation and yet more demand for water, adding pressure to tap distant reservoirs at staggering costs, or further drain underground aquifers and hasten the city's collapse, literally collapse. As I said, it's sinking. There's much more at stake than this city's well-being. At the extreme, if climate change wreaks havoc on the social, economic fabric of global linchpins like Mexico City, warns the writer of this article, Christian Parenti, quote, no amount of walls, guns, barbed wire, armed aerial drones, or permanently deployed mercenaries will be able to save one half of the planet from the other. How obvious is that? And what's not stated in this article, as we know with all mainstream sources of articles, is climate engineering. You can't have more drought on a warming planet without climate engineering. You can't. I'm not saying you can't have drought, but you must have more rain overall on a warming planet. The laws of physics say so. Climate engineering is the single great drought causal factor, period. And we're back to that point. If you're in the global warming community, if you're in the environmentalist community, and you're not addressing climate engineering, you're either incredibly ignorant of what's going on in the world around you, or you're unwilling, hypocritically unwilling, to face the single greatest environmental threat of all, short of nuclear cataclysm. Please, find some courage. Tell the truth. Face the climate engineering issue. Another headline, Holocaust waiting to happen. Brazil's arid northeast, worst drought on record as empty reservoirs may cause evacuation of entire cities. This is happening now. While we're watching theater on CNN, while we're watching CNN cover 10 minutes of the transgender bathrooms, the world is imploding. People are starving to death at staggering rates. I'll get to those figures in a few moments. Again, record drought. So many places can't happen overall in the planet without climate engineering. The atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. It must rain more, and it's not, and climate engineering is the reason it's not. From this Brazil headline, the shrunken carcasses of cows lie in scorched fields outside the city of Campina Grande in northeastern Brazil, and hungry goats search for food on the cracked earth floor as the Baqueiro reservoir that serves the desperate town dries up. After 5 years of drought, farmer Evaldo Brito says he cannot remember when the reservoir was last full, but he has never seen it this empty. Quote, "We've lost everything, bananas, beans, potatoes," Brito said. "We have to walk 3 kilometers just to wash clothes." Brazil's arid northeast is weathering its worst drought on record, and the Campina Grande, which has 400,000 residents that depend on the reservoir, is running out of water. Tip of the iceberg. Let's continue with this theme. Colorado, nearly 1,000 million trees are dead in Colorado. 1,000 million. That's a billion. Think about that. How many headlines on that have we seen? From that report, the study released Wednesday by Colorado State Forest Service out of Colorado State University calculated an estimated 834 million dead trees. And what do they blame it on? Beetles. It's just the beetles, or it's just the drought. They never mention the toxic rain filled with bioavailable metals that are known to contaminate root systems, make them weaker. The trees don't uptake nutrients. We have a scorching UV radiation situation, which we're preparing a report on that I haven't been able to release yet, but it's very shocking, very scary, done by a NASA veteran aeronautics engineer that's working directly with GeoEngineeringWatch.org. Incredibly alarming data, also affecting the trees. None of this is mentioned because, again, official agencies are paid not to disclose the truth to the public, but to hide it, to pacify them, pretending that whatever's happening is just some sort of cycle that's happened before. What's happening to our planet right now, I want to say this loudly and clearly, is no more natural than running someone over in a crosswalk, an example I've used before, and then claiming that they died of natural causes. What we've done to the planet is anything but natural. We have devastated our planet in the geologic blink of an eye. And the absolute epitome of human insanity is climate engineering, trying to play God with Earth's life support systems. Countless sources of anthropogenic damage, trees dying all over the planet at an astounding rate. If the trees die, we die. If the oceans die, we die. If we have no ozone layer, we die. And all of these cataclysms are converging at once, not to mention radioactive contamination, decimation of ecosystems all over the world, on and on and on. Another headline, another fish catastrophe. Millions of dead fish wash up along kilometers of beach in Costa Rica. That's just a sample. Would encourage everyone to look up Mass Animal Die-Off List 2017. And then look at the same list from 2016 and then 2015. You can't imagine how many die-offs are occurring all over the globe. Mass die-offs, marine and terrestrial, everywhere. And we hear nothing about it. No, we have CNN covering transgender bathrooms for 10 minutes. This insanity will not continue much longer. You can quote me on that. From the UK Independent newspaper in Britain, another headline, global quote, fish wars could break out as climate change and rising nationalism fuel competition for world's oceans. When there's not enough to go around, the law of the jungle prevails, doesn't it? And it's not just climate change. Back to geoengineering. Climate change is a massive problem, countless anthropogenic factors contributing to that very, very dire problem. But again, what's not covered, what's completely ignored and omitted, is climate engineering, which is destroying the Earth's ozone layer, which is allowing, as I mentioned, intense radiation to absolutely obliterate the Earth's plankton stocks. What's the base of the food chain for life on Earth? Plankton. Plankton populations around the globe down now 50 to 60%. And that affects more aspects of Earth's life support systems than you can possibly imagine. Plankton help form marine layers, cloud. They release unimaginable amounts of oxygen. They absorb unimaginable amounts of carbon. All of that is falling apart. Climate engineering, a major part of that equation, again, not mentioned. Now, let's listen carefully to the following statement of total delusion that was quoted from the UK Independent report. Total delusion. From the report said, quote, speaking at the American Association for the Advancement of Science's annual meeting in Boston on Thursday, a panel of experts said that with the right management and international cooperation, the number of fish in the seas and the amount caught by fishing fleets could increase over the coming decades. Really? In what world of total delusion could that happen? That's a bit like saying if pigs had wings, right, they would fly. That's how delusional that is. When these people pretend that all the things I've already just mentioned that are contributing to the mass marine ecosystem die-off don't exist, and that somehow if we just manage things better, everything will magically fix itself. Total delusion. And much of the first world nation populations want to subscribe to that total delusion because denial feels good to them, at least for the moment. Not going to be the case much longer. From the Guardian newspaper, another headline. Images of new bleaching on Great Barrier Reef heighten fears of coral death. From that report, the NOAA Coral Reef Watch's forecast for the next 4 weeks has placed an even higher level alert on the parts of the far north of northern and central barrier reef, indicating high mortality is likely. That's what's the little bit that's left of the barrier reef, that's what we're talking about, is now going to die, which will leave nothing left. Continuing from the report, corals south of Cairns and parts of the far north reef that were badly hit by last year's mass bleaching event are at fatal risk. The Great Barrier Reef's campaign director for AMCS said the projections for the next 4 weeks plus evidence of new coral bleaching were, quote, extremely concerning. Final statement from the report, the bleaching that occurred over 8 to 9 months of last year was the worst on record for the Great Barrier Reef, with as much as 85% of the coral between Cape York and Lizard Island dying. I've been to Lizard Island. I've been on 2 dive expeditions on the Great Barrier Reef, and I've been to these places, and it's heartbreaking to know that they are now being transformed into a wasteland in the virtual blink of an eye. Absolutely heartbreaking. Another headline, deep sea life faces dark future due to warming and food shortage. From that report, the deep ocean and the creatures that live there are facing a desperate future due to food shortages and changing temperatures, according to research exploring the impact of climate change and human activity on the world's oceans. Again, climate engineering left out of the equation. Climate engineering, in order to create short-term, highly toxic cooldowns, is fueling the overall warming of the planet. It's a major factor, but again, hardly the only factor. Another headline, as Arctic warms, Canada's glaciers playing major role in sea level rise. From that report, since 2005, listen to this, study finds that the surface melt off glaciers in the north has risen by 900%. Not 6, 7, 8%, 60%, 200 or 300%. No, almost 1,000%, almost 10 times worse. What does it take to wake people up? The planet's imploding right now. The record temperatures on the East Coast should be a harbinger of that, and it's happening all over the globe. We simply don't hear about it here again because CNN and other mainstream media sources are distracting us with things like transgender bathrooms. Another headline, thousands of dead bats are dropping from trees as near 50 degrees C temperatures, that's 122 Fahrenheit, bake Australia. That's how bad it is. Animals dropping from trees. These are flying foxes, by the way. They're very unique animals, dying from the heat, scattered all over the ground below trees. We don't see that here. Another headline, 50 people have died in Afghanistan in 3 days, and consider the contrast of this headline with everything I've just covered, bringing the total to weather-related deaths to 239, with 214 wounded and 520 houses destroyed. This is from blizzards, snowstorms in Afghanistan. So last year, we had a heat index in Iraq, a heat index, which is like a wind chill, a feels-like temperature of 168 degrees. We have record heat all over the planet, but somehow in certain strategic locations we have snowstorms, whether it's to create headlines in the U.S. or to simply decimate populations in regions where the U.S. and NATO has strategic interests. That's what's happening. We don't hear about that. That's an immense amount of people to die from blizzards in Afghanistan. Mainstream media hasn't touched any of this. As I stated before, record high temperatures, Canada, Australia, US, getting hard to hide the fact the planet's in total meltdown, and the only thing confusing the population are the engineered cool downs like Winter Storm Quid that is so incredibly ridiculous, surrounded by record heat. We have record warm temperatures that suddenly flash out to snow with moisture that just flowed out of the record warm Gulf of Mexico. And we have the Weather Channel paid disinformation people. One of two possibilities, I'll state again. They're either unimaginably ignorant of the profession on which they claim to be experts, or they are lying. Take your pick. They're hiding geoengineering. That's exactly what they're doing at the corporate-owned Weather Channel. The military-industrial corporate complex owns all major weather dissemination. Remember that. Another headline, fears grow that climate conflicts could lead to war. Again, we're back to the same headline that would be equal to leaping out in front of a speeding semi could harm you. How obvious is this? Why would it be a fear? It's certainly a reality. It's not just a possibility. From that report, among the 21st century threats posed by climate change, again, climate engineering completely omitted, rising seas, melting permafrost, and superstorms, European leaders are warning of a last century risk they know all too well, war. Continuing from this report, focusing too narrowly on the environmental consequences of global warming underestimates the military threats. Top European and United Nations officials said at a global security conference in Munich this weekend, that was last weekend, their warnings follow the conclusions of defense and intelligence agencies that climate change could trigger resource and border conflicts. Could. Why does it use the word could? When there's not enough to eat, is it a question that there'll be conflict? Why is that a question? And they pose such dire news with statements like this to try to not alarm the herd too much. Wouldn't want to panic the population, would we? We have to see through this idiocracy. And how ignorant would we be if, knowing how dire a threat that the military-industrial complex knows the disintegrating climate is, do we think they would ask our permission before they would geoengineer all over the globe to try to keep business as usual? Of course they would do whatever they want. They always have, and they always will, until the population decides enough is enough. Finishing from this report, climate change is a threat multiplier. And by the way, what does the military-industrial complex call climate engineering? A force multiplier. These go hand in hand. Climate change is a threat multiplier that leads to social upheaval and possibly even armed conflict. Again, possibly. When there's not enough to eat, we're not going to have conflict. Report continues, the UN's top climate official said at the conference, which was attended by U.S. Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security James Mattis and John Kelly. Even as European Union countries struggle to assimilate millions of African and Middle Eastern migrants and refugees, security officials are bracing for more of the same in the future. Secretary General Antonio Guterres named the climate change and population growth as the two most serious megatrends threatening international peace and stability. It's threatening the existence of the human race. It's here. It's not on the horizon. It's here. Those who doubt that, those who have been sheltered, especially in the U.S., with the massive imports of food from all over the world to keep the shelves stocked, as I covered in last week's show, imports in the tens of billions of dollars to make sure shelves are stocked, because the one population they most don't want to panic until the last moment is the U.S. population. Here's the headline. This is from Reuters. These headlines are not from some fringe internet source. Not that we don't have credible data on the internet. In fact, it's the only place we can find credible data in most cases. If you look at the right source, you can get frontline data on the internet. You have to look for that type of data with film footage and facts that are verifiable. Plenty of it there. Not going to get it from most mainstream sources. Here's a headline from Reuters. Famine may kill 20 million people in the next 6 months. I'll read that again. Famine may kill 20 million people in the next 6 months. And all the while, CNN is talking about transgender bathrooms. From that report, more than 20 million people, greater than the population of Romania or Florida, risk dying from starvation within 6 months in 4 separate famines, the UN World Food Program chief economist stated. Wars in Yemen, which our country and Britain are helping to fuel with arms. Saudi Arabia is doing it. Went over that earlier. Why don't we say anything to Saudi Arabia? The petrodollar. Went over all that. Wars in Yemen, northeastern Nigeria, and southern Sudan have devastated households and driven up prices, while drought in East Africa has ruined the agricultural economy. Just like the drought that devastated the California economy, now we've gone to deluge. Same thing in Africa. That's why U.S. boots are on the ground in so many countries. Those countries have been devastated with weather warfare. They know exactly what they have to do in order to survive. The leaders of those countries, they have to allow U.S. occupation. That's the bottom line. This is weather warfare all over the globe. Now the consequences are manifesting, and the consequences of the human race's assault against nature will soon be total if we continue on this path. As I've stated so many times, man's war against nature is a war against himself, a war against all life on earth. Continuing from the report, quote, it's almost overwhelming to comprehend that in the 21st century, people are still experiencing famines of such magnitude. We're talking about 20 million people, and all this within the next 6 months. Why is it overwhelming to comprehend? If you examine the entire situation, it's impossible to comprehend that it wouldn't happen. That's reality. It's only impossible to comprehend this would happen, given everything that's going on in the world, if you're wearing rose-colored lenses and you refuse to look at reality. Final statements from the report. The global humanitarian system is already struggling with a historic surge in migration. Humanitarian aid is at record high levels, but demand is growing exponentially faster, creating a huge gap. When there's not enough to go around, the law of the jungle will prevail. This is the bottom line. And the equation could not be more nonlinear. That's imperative to remember. It's happening at an exponential rate. Remember the story I covered in the last week's show, or the week before, I believe? The Union of Concerned Scientists advancing the doomsday clock forward to 2.5 minutes before midnight. Is the power structure preparing? Absolutely. The simple answer is yes, as fast as they can. I also gave a timeline on a previous show. If you overlaid the 4.5 billion year lifespan of Earth over the period of a week, everything the human race has done to the planet, the destruction we have caused, if that 1 week period represented 4.5 billion years, we would have done the damage we have done in 1/40th of a second before midnight on the last day. The blink of an eye. And how many people still today delusionally believe that this direction can continue? How can they possibly believe that? You cannot perpetually loot, plunder, and pillage a finite planet with finite resources and expect to survive. You can't destroy Earth's life support systems and expect to survive. If we stay on this course, we will not survive on the near-term horizon. That's a mathematical fact. On that note, another headline from last week. Arctic Doomsday Seed Vault receives 50,000 new deposits. If you don't know what the Arctic Doomsday Seed Vault is, you need to look this up. This is preparation of the power structure to store the Earth's seeds because they know what's coming. Although their lust for power prevents them from changing course, it's up to us to change course because those in power won't do it. From this report about the Arctic Doomsday Seed Vault, this is by the Associated Press. Nearly 10 years after the Doomsday Seed Vault opened in an Arctic island, some 50,000 new samples from seed collections around the world have been deposited in the world's largest repository built to safeguard against wars or natural disasters, wiping out global food crops, which is happening right now, by the way. And for those that have operated with the sort of mentality that this is all happening somewhere else, to someone else, and thus they chose not to worry about it. What sort of sense of justice is that? The mentality that people care only when something happens to them. That's not a sense of justice. That's a sense of selfishness. Even if somehow, by some magical means, all of us here were sheltered, all of us here in the U.S. were sheltered from everything happening around the globe, would that absolve us of our responsibility to care about what's happening to others in faraway lands? Absolutely not. Not if we have any sense of honor left. If my brothers and sisters in Africa or Rwanda, other countries, are dying horrible deaths, and there's anything I can do about that, I have to try. Don't we all have to try? Is that not an obligation as a citizen of the miraculous planet we've been given? Are we not part of a greater community? Or are we now so conditioned to be so incredibly selfish that we care not for what's happening to our brothers and sisters in faraway lands that are suffering in so many cases because of what our country has done? Delivering freedom and democracy at the barrel of a gun that had nothing to do with freedom and democracy and had only to do with resources and empire, done in our name. And if we don't care about that happening, then what are we? Is that patriotism? That might makes right? That we overlook whatever our country does? And how can we give advice or some sort of moral direction to anybody else when we have the massive log in our own eye as a country? How can you tell, as the proverb goes, how can you help your neighbor remove the splinter from their eye when you have a log in yours? These are things we should all consider. Whatever happens to our brothers and sisters in other countries ultimately happens to us. We can't live like this. We won't live like this much longer. And right now, the danger of the power structure is greater than it has ever been because they are running out of options. I want to quote a man named Charlie Reese. He said this, and he's completely accurate. American tyranny has come gradually, like a slow rising river. Each of us does not realize the danger until the water comes to our door. Until then, it is merely someone else's problem, and a problem that we fool ourselves into thinking won't reach us. An incredibly naive notion. How many people have looked the other way for how long because they didn't want to disturb their own personal world? And that's the first step in making a difference. In abandoning the tendency to cling to the reality that you desperately wanted to happen. Because if that's what you do, you will have immense difficulty being any benefit for the greater good. You're focused only on your own craving for the life or the reality that you wanted. This sort of desire is mentioned in all the great traditions, biblical texts, Asian texts, in fact, in Asian texts and Asian philosophies, which is very parallel in many ways to biblical philosophies. The three poisons, desire, aversion, and illusion. We're either trying to move towards something we crave, we're trying to avoid something we loathe, or we're not seeing clearly. And those three premises should be considered by all of us, because we are living in a state of mass delusion in our country, in much of the world. Mass, utter, total delusion. And when you look at the media we see, what's covered in our papers, pages of sports, and the type of stories I mentioned from CNN, and all sorts of mass distraction that the power structure is carefully orchestrating and the population is unfortunately still falling for, anyone looking through a completely clear lens would understand and realize that we are living in quite literally an orchestrated asylum. While this miraculous planet that was thriving not so long ago is now dying by the day, and we are being distracted by every imaginable means. This cannot continue. It will not continue. What do we do? Ultimately, isn't that the question? What do we do? So many people ask that question, and I hope those asking that question actually look for what we post at geoengineeringwatch.org. In the upper left of the home page, activist suggestions, and that file is filled with links to many, many different avenues that can be taken for those that choose to help change the course of the Titanic that we're all currently passengers on. There's a flaming arrow link. It's an image of a man with the flaming arrow near the top left end. There's a completely packaged intro letter, links, everything needed for anyone to send out a flaming arrow of awareness, if you will, to groups, organizations, individuals that would care if they knew. And now they're being forced to wake up because of unfolding conditions. I've said this would happen for a decade and a half. I said it would come because that's what the data dictated. It had to come. The imploding biosphere, the imploding climate system that's being further torn apart by climate engineering would make it impossible to hide the severity of what we face, and that time has come. It's happening now. While this is occurring, and people are beginning to look up and consider what they had previously ignored, now is the most effective time to sow seeds of awareness. Now is when the soil is the most fertile, and it's up to all of us to do this. It can't be done by a few. This war cannot be waged by a few, and too many people feel there's some silver bullet solution to this problem. There's not. The entire system is corrupt. Agencies are corrupt. Every elected official, with very few exceptions, are completely corrupt. They're all part of the cabal, the secret societies that run the world, period. That's what we have. So it's up to us at the grassroots level to bring reality to light. And if we can do that, if we can reach a critical mass of awareness, if we can wake up our brothers and sisters in the military, we have a chance at changing directions. And how can we know unless we try? How can we know unless we stand and make our voices heard what difference we may have made if we had only tried? We must remember this and consider this, that those in power are not gods. They're nothing more than twisted, demented individuals that have come to acquire such power because we, the people, have allowed it. Because of the legions of order followers that have so far been unable to locate their sense of honor and their sense of virtue. And I know many of these people. I've worked with a number of these people in various agencies, various academicians that refuse to believe anything, no matter how unarguable or verifiable, unless or until a power structure ordained institution tells them it's true. And these are considered the brightest in our society? Something's very wrong with this equation. The current control the ruling elite wield is due to the complacency, willful blindness, and program bias of the majority in our societies, especially first world societies. I would ask this: is this how the story ends? Or will we collectively stand up and rewrite the nightmare that is currently unfolding? What will you do today, not tomorrow? Tomorrow's too late. We must keep our faces to the wind and forge forward into the gathering storm. We must never yield. We must never give up. This belongs to us and us alone. It cannot be taken, ever. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.
You're listening to UCY.tv.